Good afternoon and good morning to those joining us from other parts of the world. I am Valerie Lucas McEwen. I am a professor at California State University, Long Beach. I'm also a member of the IAM Conference Committee. I'd like to welcome you to Recovery is the Future, Navigating the Transition from Response at the IAM Reimagined Virtual Conference. A couple of housekeeping items for you to make note of before I turn it over to our presenters. All participant audio is muted and all questions will be held until after the presentations. At the end of the presentation, the chat box feature will be enabled on your screen. Use the chat box to ask the speakers questions. Just type in your question and we will answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. In the event we are unable to get to all the questions during this session, you can reach out to the speakers directly by searching for their name in the speaker directory on the left-hand side of the virtual platform. You can request a video chat live in your own conference room or schedule a meeting for later to answer your follow-up questions or just to network with the speakers. Thank you again for being with us today, and now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Turn the page. Jenny Novak and Randy Steyer worked for the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services during two of the most destructive wildfire seasons in state history. Both served as division supervisors for the state, assisting local jurisdictions in working with Fema on recovery operations for multiple presidentially declared disasters. Jenny Novak is a certified emergency manager, currently working as the Emergency and Continuity Director for the California State University System, and Randy Steyer is currently the Director of Emergency Management at the University of Southern California, Irvine. Thank you all for being as speakers. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. Welcome to our presentation. And as Valerie mentioned, we're going to be focusing on our experience working at Cal OES together during two very destructive wildfire seasons, specifically on the transition from response to recovery and what we learned from those things. So our presentation is going to be somewhat California-centric, although we will discuss what some nuances are that might come across in other states in the country. And we are going to focus a lot on wildfires, but we hope that the lessons learned from these responses could be transferable to other types of hazards as well. So with that, I want to give it over to Randy for some intro on what we've been doing here in California this year and the past few years.
Thanks, Jenny. The first thing I'd really like to do is kind of bring everything to perspective for what we're going through right now in the state of California. I've got this wildfire map up here. This is the California wildfires, the areas that burned in the state of California from 1910 to 2019. The last year being 2019, we had almost 300,000 acres burned. Got the 10 largest wildfires over on the other side there. A couple of things that have kind of really occurred very recently, though, kind of impacts, and puts into great perspective what we're dealing with here in California. I mean, you look at it between the beginning of 2007 and the end of 2016, they had over almost 6.5 million acres burned in the state of California in that 10-year period. Since October of 2017, over that amount, over 6.5 million acres have burned just in that period of time. Of those, and this isn't accurate because this slide is only a few days old, but it's changed quite a bit. We have over almost 3.5 million acres that have burned just between July 1st and September 30th of this year. So we've had an incredibly active fire season of the likes nobody who's actively working wildfires has ever seen in the state. Let's look at the 10 largest wildfires as of 2019. The Ranch Fire, the Thomas Fire, Cedar Fire, those were all very big fires in the state of California. Well, the Ranch Fire is no longer the first or the biggest fire in the state of California at a little over 400,000 acres. That's been replaced by the August Fire, August of this year. It says 949,000 acres. That's actually gone over 1 million acres. So that's one of the first giga fires that we've had in the state of California in modern times. Then the Thomas Fire, which Jenny and I both worked on, and was the biggest fire beyond the Cedar Fire back in 2017, 2018. That's been replaced by the lightning fire, the SCU lightning fire in July of 2020 at about 400,000 acres. Then the LNU lightning fire in August 2020 at about a little over 3.5 or 362,000 acres. Then the North Fire in August of 2020 at 314, almost 315,000 acres. Then the Creek Fire in September of 2020 at just over 300,000 acres. So think about this. 5 of the 6 largest wildfires in California history have occurred between July and September of this year, July and October actually now of this year. And the time between the Cedar Fire, which was the largest fire in the state of California, and the Thomas Fire, when it became #1, was 14 years. So we are into the foreseeable future having these massive, massive wildfire outbreaks in California. And that's why this discussion about the transition from disaster into recovery is so important. I started with Cal OES back on October 10th of 2017. My first day at work was supposed to be getting my feet wet and sort of learning how to be the deputy regional administrator, which was a job I had gotten hired to do. But that day was also the second day of the Canyon 2 fire, which was a big fire in Orange County. About 25 structures were lost. It was a pretty big event for a county like Orange County. So I ended up, instead of being the deputy regional administrator, being the REOC coordinator, the REOC manager at the Regional Emergency Operations Center for the Southern region of Cal OES. So that's how I really kind of got my feet wet in fires. Shortly thereafter, I was at this time, of course, in the state of California, October 2017 is always going to be known as the California firestorms that occurred. Up to this point, we'd never seen anything like that in the state, at least not for a very long time. I was deployed up to the Tubbs Fire in Santa Rosa, and this is really the first time I ever saw what a wildfire will do. That picture in the left side, that's Coffey Park. That's a neighborhood in the city of Santa Rosa. That's 2,200 homes burnt to the ground in that neighborhood. I stood in the middle of that park, and as a Marine Corps combat veteran, I can say I've never seen anything like that. It just completely, utterly blew my mind to see the devastating effects of that kind of fire and see the impact that these wildfires have on these communities. Now I'll kick it over to Jenny for her perspective.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about how I got into this and my first response at Cal OES, which Randy's mentioning October of 2017. Well, that happened in Northern California and a little in SoCal, but then come December 4th, 2017, we started a very intense wildfire storm here in Southern California. And the very first fire to kick that off was the Thomas Fire, which ended up becoming the largest fire in California history for a short period of time. And for me, that's a very personal memory and a personal story because I was assigned to Ventura County because somebody had retired 2 weeks earlier. So even though I lived 100 miles south of Ventura, that was my assignment. So when their conditions were ripe with a red flag warning and I saw a tweet about a little fire near Santa Paula burning, I thought, gosh, I really hope it doesn't turn into anything big. But of course, a couple hours later, I got the frantic call from my manager telling me that I needed to go and I needed to go now. So I hastily packed an overnight bag and I got in my car, my state vehicle, and I started driving north. And I remember feeling those winds starting to push my vehicle. I remember how much of a struggle it was just to keep my lane positioning because I was feeling those really intense winds. And I remember that my knuckles, when I had my fingers gripped, sweaty gripped fingers on that steering wheel, were just starting to crack and bleed because the humidity was just bone dry already. And I remember when I reached the top of the Conejo grade, which is normally this beautiful precipice where you can see the Pacific Ocean and you can see the Oxnard Plain and the Topa Topa Mountains in the background. Well, the only thing I saw that night was pure darkness, with the exception of this orange crown of flames dancing on the horizon. You see that here this picture is similar to what I saw off in the distance, these flames. It was like a jack-o'-lantern smile in those teeth. And I just remember sinking down into the valley that night and that it was just this dark and foreboding night. And nobody remembers that power outage, but it was just pure blackness in that entire valley. And with 500,000 people living there, I would have thought I should have encountered that signature comfort of metropolitan lights. And as I was driving along, I knew there should have been buildings that I could see on either side of the freeway, like a normal night, but all I saw were these huge dark shadows. And as I exited the freeway, I remember I started to realize that it was a very hazardous situation, not just an eerie one, but the traffic signals were out and it was creating a bit of a hazard as people were kind of uncertain of what to do. And as I was driving, the tree branches and the other debris would just suddenly materialize in front of my car and I would have to swerve a little bit. And I looked around at all those residential homes as I was driving toward that government center. And it was just crazy because they should have been lit up with Christmas lights. But instead, I just saw the dark outlines of snowmen and reindeer on the lawns, and it looked a lot more like Halloween decor than Christmas cheer. As I got to the parking lot at the government center, I was struck by the contrast of the brightness of the flames. And I was just amazed that that little fire I had heard about on Twitter just hours earlier had made its way 15 miles to the west and was now lapping at the back door of the city of Ventura. And as I got out of my car, I could feel the heat from those flames just a couple of major blocks away from where we were there. And I could smell that thick smoke just kind of choking in the air as I went in to join my fellow emergency managers in the EOC on that chaotic night where over 500 structures would be lost here in the neighborhoods that you can see just from the parking lot. But thankfully, due to the heroic efforts of firefighters and my fellow emergency managers who didn't hesitate to issue their first wireless emergency alert, lives would certainly be saved that night. So I want to put into perspective a little bit what the Thomas Fire looked like in terms of its footprint. So on the next slide, you're going to see some of that compared with other major metropolitan areas in the United States. So you can see a comparison with the Bay Area, New York, Chicago, and really just get an idea what this fire looked like. And now to think there are some that are so much bigger than this in California, it really is mind-blowing. So the next slide, we discuss the recovery group model, which is really critical because at this point in response, you really already need to start thinking about recovery because response doesn't happen without recovery. It's always going to be there. So you need to address these issues up front to set yourself on the best course for smooth sailing throughout the duration of recovery because it's of a long duration and it's important to get this right in the beginning. So you can start by establishing a unified recovery group model, include your senior leadership. So if you're at a county level or a city level, you want that to be your most executive team leading that. It's really important so that you can get buy-in across all the departments. For a wildfire situation like this, Ventura County utilized a few different functional task forces. So housing was a big part of that because we had many houses and structures that were lost. So that and debris, getting all of those burned out houses and other structures out of there was really a critical piece of that. And Randy's going to get into more details on that in a minute. Health, of course, this was a public health hazard, so we needed health services involved. Watershed task force is to evaluate all of the secondary hazards that might come after a wildfire. You might get debris flow, and so you really have to look at what kind of burn scars you're dealing with. And then fiscal for reimbursement, and then myself as a state representative and my FEMA colleagues, both this and then a year later in Ventura County, we were dealing with the Woolsey Hill fires, which was also a federally declared major disaster. So we had two of those within a 1-year period in Ventura County. So we were definitely coordinating a lot with the federal government. I'll talk a little bit later about what that looks like to prepare for FEMA. But first, let's hear about the debris from Randy.
Yeah, one of the major issues in any disaster is going to be debris management. Obviously, in the wildfire situations in California, this became a very big process that we had to deal with. We had literally tens of thousands of homes just in the 2017 wildfire season that had burnt to the ground. Part of the state of California, what we've done in the state with Cal OES working with Cal Recycle, which is our statewide recycling coordinator, that we created this debris management program in the state of California to help establish that debris removal process in these jurisdictions that are impacted by these fires. The state of California agrees with probably every other state in the country that when a neighborhood burns down or several houses in a neighborhood burn down, the last thing you want is to leave that debris there just to sit. The whole purpose of the recovery process is to bring that economic piece back into the neighborhoods, and also to create that sense of normalcy back into those neighborhoods that are impacted, not just for the people who lost their homes, but for the people who didn't lose their homes, whose neighborhoods are irreparably changed. So the state has developed this program. It all hinges really on the authority of the public health officer, because the first part of the debris management process is the hazardous materials removal. Every home that burns has all levels of propane tanks and cleaners and pool supplies and all that that have to be taken out to make the area safe to begin removing the actual burn debris. Like I said, for the state of California, the key partners in that are the Department of Toxic Substance Control, which provide the personnel to go and actually physically remove that material. That health officer in the state of California, that health officer order is so important, because that gives the state the right to go onto these properties without authorization from the owners to get that toxic material off of there. So working with the Environmental Protection Agency is also a big deal, as well as a Cal Recycle, like I noticed I talked about earlier. Go to my next slide. Some of this process, I'm not going to get into this too much into detail, but it all starts with that emergency order, and then we have the hazardous material, the site assessment, asbestos removal, chimneys and slabs are a big deal. Vehicles that have been burnt out are a big deal as well. The ash and debris, the concretes and slabs, people whose homes have burned down, they actually want to keep their slabs. So we have to go through a process of telling them, those slabs have been irreparably damaged by that fire that was burning on top of them. And then the erosion control, all the final processes of it. It's a very advanced process, or a very complicated process, a lot of moving parts. So it has to be coordinated. That's part of where the debris removal operations center comes in. This is basically an operations center like an EOC that the purpose of it is to coordinate all those moving pieces. The first thing that they have to establish is to get that right of entry, because now that the hazardous material is gone, the public health threat is gone, now the property owners have to give the state the right to go onto that property and remove that material, all that burn material. This has a lot to do with public information, such a massive key to this. Getting all the people together who've lost their homes, like explaining the process to them in detail, like as deep a detail as you can. You have people who have lost everything. A lot of them are not going to be happy with the response that occurred or what the government is doing. So you really have to reach out and make sure that everybody understands the program. And the venue to really do this is these town hall meetings. And it's not just one, it's many. It's all over the areas that the burn impact is at. So this is just a picture that was taken just outside of the Coffee Park area in Santa Rosa, I believe. This is what it looked like. Obviously, these homes all burnt to the ground. You got vehicles there. You've got a lot of hazardous materials there. This is before the debris removal. After the debris removal process, you have a bunch of clean lots that are clean. All these sites have been tested for materials. Soil samples have been taken. And the goal of the program is to leave lots for the residents to rebuild on, or at least if people don't rebuild, giving a neighborhood that doesn't look like it's been burnt to the ground. That's so important to the communities. And I should say that, the cost of this program, the state of California tries to recover primarily through people's debris removal riders and their insurance. Not everybody has that. So the state is not made whole on this process. The state spends a lot of money to unrecoverable money to make this process happen. But in the state of California, we believe that it's better to spend that money. This is money well spent to make those neighborhoods at least something that's habitable and without those hazards from the burn debris that's left over from these horrible wildfires. This is just a summary of some of the operations that we've done since 2007. Just this slide really just shows that this is an extensive program. You can see some of the costs of it to the state. It's an expensive program, but once again, it's one that we as taxpayers in the state of California believe is worth it. Now let Jenny talk about public information.
Yeah, so I want to expand a little bit on what Randy was saying about public information and take it a little bit back to during the disaster and some of the things that you'll see during response. The utilization of emergency notification systems is a huge thing that many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with. During an emergency, you want to push that information out fast to all of the right people through all available channels. And as you transition into recovery, the way that you work with public information changes a little bit. Press conferences, definitely something you see a lot of in response, and you'll start to see them into recovery. Then you'll start to see them kind of taper off. And as you move further into recovery, you'll see the establishment of disaster-specific recovery websites as a really key avenue for public information. So you might have a page that you devote toward emergency response, and you want to keep that for the next hazard that might happen, but you want to be able to have a page for people to reference the information on, say, the Woolsey fire. So you have to create a website specific to that where survivors can go and access information on an updated basis. So you can have, you know, ongoing press releases, links to other community resources that people can get help with, all the FAQs regarding debris management, any other programs that the county or the state or the city have available. So that information can live there. It's really a great spot. And then town halls, you see those also kind of evolve over the process. So you might get town halls still during response. It's very common in a fire that's ongoing to have those town halls led by the fire department. They're providing information about what the fire is doing, where they think it's going next, how the response is going. When you move into recovery, in Ventura County, it was really a best practice for the county to organize these recovery town halls and to have the leads from those different task forces that I was talking about earlier come and be available to share what they were doing for the public, so that you get an idea of what the recovery process looks like and where you're going. So those are really good town halls. And then we would also have the debris specific town halls, because as Randy was mentioning, there's a lot of details about the program that people need. So that really takes an entire evening itself. You can't cram it in with other stuff. And that is specific for people that have damages that might need that removed on their property. And then you also see another series of town halls, maybe for the secondary hazards and planning for mudslides and debris flow after that. But one really important thing to say is it's just so critical to get in front of this public information. And if your agency organizes it yourself, then you're going to be able to get a clear and coordinated and accurate message out to the public. But if you don't think that you're capable of, getting in front of this message and organizing your own town halls, then you're going to leave a void where other entities are going to come in and they're going to provide information because there's a gap and they need to fill it. And it might not always be information that you want. You might not be able to fully control that. We saw that happen here in Southern California with newspapers organizing their own town halls because local government wasn't doing it. So, and those can quickly turn into hostile environments where they're just talking about what the government isn't doing. So that's really important. And I want to talk a little bit more specifically about those recovery town halls on the next slide here. As Randy kind of mentioned, the locations are really important. You want to make sure that you have them accessible to survivors near their home communities. So fires can be massive and have multiple fronts. You don't want to just have one recovery town hall at your government center or another location. You want to try to bring these to people as best you can. So this can be any hyper localized place like a high school, a middle school, even an elementary school, a rec center, a church, or other faith-based center. You just want to make it easy and accessible for people in their area. They've already been through so much. They don't want to have to drive in their cars and come to you. You need to bring these to them. That's why it's a series of town halls. In terms of speakers, it's always nice to have your elected officials that give some opening remarks because these are their constituents. You might have to work with multiple elected officials just depending on the size of your event. And then their task force leads, as I mentioned, FEMA and state can also provide info. Handouts is another key piece. Otherwise, people are going to be scrambling to take notes, to write down any URLs that people are sharing or trying to copy down email addresses that they might need. If you have a handout with all that information pre-designed and ready to go, it's really, really helpful time saver for people. These question cards that you see here are another tool that was used in Ventura County that I would call a best practice, because the people could select which category they wanted to speak about and write out their questions. So then the moderator could hand those cards to the various speakers on those subjects, and then they could think about their response and give a coherent response to maybe multiple questions on the same subject at once. rather than just having an open mic where you really can't control what somebody's going to say, and they may not even have a question. They might just want to complain and get some time in front of open mic. So this kind of helped to mitigate those type of situations, and we were able to run the town halls very smoothly using that. And we also invited, another important part is the FEMA Disaster Survivor Assistance Team. So I'm going to go into more details about that in a couple slides, but they're really important to bring to these town halls as well, because they're trying to reach out to those that might have lost their homes. So they're a good part. They can have a table kind of in the back and interact with survivors that way. So the next slide shows an example of what that recovery task or the recovery structure looks like. So you might think a lot about EOC org charts, right? But recovery has its own organizational structure, and that's something you need to think about in advance and really prepare for. If you get a federally declared major disaster, FEMA is going to come in and they're going to be rolling deep with a lot of staff on their side. So they're going to be looking for state counterparts, and they're going to be looking for those state counterparts to plug in with the local. So if you are a local government, you need to think about all of these things in terms of where you're going to house an operation for this size of group. You can see, they had safety officers, executive assistants, a disability integration, they had external affairs, they had their own individual assistance group, mitigation, public assistance. They had a whole planning team that would produce an IAP for recovery only, and then they had logistics. That's a lot of people coming in right away. So on the next slide, it shows some of the examples of facilities that they might be looking for in terms of where they could park their mobile command center, for one. That's first, in the Woolsey fire, we had a FEMA representatives come into the EOC to kind of get an idea of what we were doing as the president was deciding to declare a disaster. And once it was declared, their first question was, where can we bring our mobile command center? Where's the best place to park this vehicle? So that's one of the questions the local government had to consider, and something you might want to think about in advance. After using the mobile command center, they'll also open what they call an initial operating facility. So this gives them a bigger footprint. You can see this mobile facility isn't that large. And actually in the Woolsey fire, they utilized some conferencing space within a local hotel. And that's where they kind of started to really expand their operation and see what was happening on the ground, getting those people in. And the joint field office is going to be a more permanent location where they're actually going to rent something for several months at a time. It ended up being an office building in our situation. And that can be established for years, as long as it takes to get through the recovery process. So that's a really kind of a permanent facility. And the next slide kind of shows a couple of other facilities that you might consider. You're probably going to want to put together a local assistance center. Most are probably familiar with that, but it's a one-stop shop for any disaster resources for survivors in your local community or with state resources. When FEMA gets involved, they call it a disaster recovery center, and it may or may not be co-located with your local assistance center. Often people have their local assistance center open just for a short period of time. The disaster recovery center will be open for the duration that FEMA is offering individual and household support if you have that activated in your disaster. And so that's usually a minimum of right around 60 days or so. That's how long they're going to want to operate that. So in Ventura County, in the Thomas fire, we had that at a credit union. In the Woolsey fire, it was at an old framing store that they were able to rent out for a couple months. And a little bit more about the individuals and households program. This program is designed to not to make people whole again, which is a common misconception, but to provide disaster survivor assistance. So the maximum grant for this is only $34,000 or so. And that maximum grant is not given out that often. So usually people are getting less than that amount. This program is designed to help address underinsurance. So if you're insured, unless you have any gaps in that insurance, you're probably not going to qualify for this program. But if you do have gaps in the program, in your insurance, this is where the program can really help supplement. And it's really critical to help communicate that from the date of the declared disaster, you only have 60 days to apply for disaster assistance through this. So if you have to wait on your insurance, and it might be more than 60 days till you find out what your coverage is going to be, then you might miss out on an opportunity to apply for this if you find out you're underinsured, which happened a lot in Ventura County because the costs are just going up, and people aren't necessarily keeping up with what the value of their home is with what their insurance is. So that's a really important thing to communicate. And the disaster survivor assistance teams I mentioned earlier, they're going to be looking to you as the local government for assistance in knowing where to go to connect with survivors. So they're going to want to know, where do these people frequent? What are the main shopping centers? Are there recreation centers, other community areas that these people might be that they can help find them? What kinds of events are happening in your community where they can plug in, and they'll go door to door, they'll canvas, they'll set up anywhere with a table and just try to connect with survivors as much as possible. That's their main goal, is just trying to make those content. And then the Small Business Administration, they'll also want to set up their own kind of little operations center where they can provide loans not only to businesses, but also to individuals, because in the event of a presidentially declared major disaster, FEMA makes available low interest loans to individuals. So it's not just for business, but it's administered through the SBA. So people often don't know about that, but if you've exhausted other types of help, this is a really good piece of it. And you'll also want to be doing a damage assessment, and this might happen before FEMA gets called in. It just sort of depends on what the timeline is for your particular disaster. But if they are coming in to do a damage assessment with your state OES or EMA, then you might want to think about presenting about additional impacts that makes your circumstance unique. So for instance, in Ventura County, even though we had lost maybe just over 1,000 structures, we also wanted to show them that it impacted way more than just those houses, because there was a ripple effect, and it would displace other people who weren't living in that area. If people were renting from somebody that lost their home in the burn area, then that homeowner would move back into their rental facility and they would displace that person. They would also look at the economic impacts in terms of, if you lost an avocado farm, you're not just losing the crop for that year, but you're losing the trees for 5 years, because if the trees are damaged, they're going to need some time to grow back. So that's a really important thing to consider also. And another thing that really helps to make this work is the long-term recovery group. So in Ventura County, we organized a long-term recovery group after the Thomas fire that has still continued actually to this day. I have a meeting with them later this week, actually, where I'm presenting, and it's going to be addressing all kinds of different elements of response where government isn't the primary provider. So it's often the nonprofit organizations and other NGOs that step up to fill in those gaps. So you can see, after they've exhausted help from insurance or FEMA, the nonprofits come in at the end to try to fill those gaps and to try to help you learn to navigate with your insurance, like United Policyholders. That's a great group. The long-term recovery group could be American Red Cross, Salvation Army, 211, other grassroots organizations that might pop up in the aftermath of a disaster. And if you have manpower, money, or materials to contribute, then you're welcome to join this. And by joining this recovery group, you can have a coordinated case management effort, so a survivor doesn't have to answer the same questions for 5 different organizations. If those organizations are talking to one another and providing assistance in a coordinated manner, it makes things a lot easier on the survivor. And that's really what we want to do. And that's what our end mission is. So I want Randy to talk a little bit more about secondary impacts, because that's really critical as well.
Yeah, of course, as you recover from the disaster, there's always the potential for those secondary disasters that will occur. These photos are all from Montecito, California, which is in southern Santa Barbara County in the Thomas fire burn area. And there was as Jenny mentioned earlier, a watershed task force that was set up just to assess all those burn slopes in the mountains above this entire region of Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. And even though Herculean effort was taken to assess and map and do LiDAR surveys of all this area in early January, there was a massive storm that hit the area just above Montecito. And obviously the result of that was the Montecito mudslide, where 24 people lost their lives, and 2 of them were never recovered. So those impacts do occur. And while you're still planning for the recovery from the initial disaster, having to plan and be flexible with dealing with those secondary impacts is always a big thing. Now, not always are these secondary impacts going to be what it was the complete and separate disaster, the Montecito debris flow event. Shortly after in 2018, after I was demobilized from Ventura, we had the Holy Fire in the mountains above Orange County, California. While Orange County, our county, wasn't necessarily impacted, the county of Riverside, across on the other side of the mountains, received a lot of burn area. And you can see in this photo here some of the canyons that lead down into the area. This is the city of Lake Elsinore. And a lot of these canyons, I've been hiking in several of these canyons. They're long, steep, narrow, full of burn debris canyons. So when the rain started happening shortly after this fire, the county of Riverside had to make decisions on how they're going to deal with it, because you're talking about all these three different canyons, Dickey, Leech, McVicker, and Rice canyons, all very long, very narrow canyons, all of them draining out into these areas. And although they had debris basins, we saw in the Montecito event that that's not necessarily going to do anything if you have a major event. And each one of these canyons represented the same potential hazard as Montecito. So the county was put in a pretty tough spot, dealing with, do we evacuate? Don't we evacuate? When do we evacuate? What about the people who won't evacuate? Evacuation fatigue is a very real thing. And this was happening in a couple of week periods where the county had to, I think, give 3 evacuation orders because of these potential storms that were going to potentially create the rainfall that could cause this kind of devastation. I mean, when you look at it, all of these canyons, it's like a fire hose with a mouth that's a mile or 2 miles wide, dropping all of that debris from the burn area into this little, maybe 5 square mile area. So it was a very big deal. Having to prepare for that and being prepared for that is so important to this process, even as you're recovering from the initial disaster.
Yeah. So as we move toward closing, I want to say a few things, thinking about the future and thinking about the way that going through these disasters together for Randy and I really impacted us in the way that we lead our careers and the way that we now plan and mitigate for future disasters after having gone through response and recovery. It's really important, as much as you can, if you're in a position where you can inspire the next generation by having interns or young professionals in your organization and inviting them to come and to take part in response and recovery, it can really change their outlook, and it can really motivate them to pursue a career in emergency management. Because while planning and mitigation is normally the bulk of what we do, response and recovery really shows you why we do what we do. So I want to talk a little bit about that actually in the next slide. Is a conceptual model that I put together based on our experiences in 2020 in emergency management, and how we are just in this cycle of response and recovery. It's no longer that traditional nice pretty circle of disaster cycle you've seen where it's like evenly divided between response and recovery, preparedness, mitigation. Not in 2020 and not for the foreseeable future. We have response and then we have recovery. You can't have one without the other. And then we've just had surges of COVID, of wildfires, of civil unrest, of public safety power shutoffs, of storms. And when that happens, you really don't have much time for preparedness at all. And it's a very exhausting sort of state to be in constantly as an emergency manager. But it makes this presentation and this topic of the transition between response and recovery even more critical, but a little bit more complicated. So on the next slide, I show a conceptual model from one of the campuses in the California State University system that shows how you might be able to operate response and recovery simultaneously. Can you go to the next slide? Oh, there it goes, where it shows kind of your EOC might still be active for response, but you still need to operate recovery at the same time. So you might have task forces for recovery that are active at the same time as your EOC. And those both need to funnel up to your emergency executives and your policy group. And you need to share information back and forth between those two phases of disaster management when they're happening at the same time, because it's no longer just this nice linear pattern where we move from response into recovery. It's happening concurrently now, and we need to think about that a little bit differently. But now I'm going to hand it back to Randy for some final thoughts.
Now, I just want to sort of bring this back around into, with all the stuff that we do, and we're so busy as emergency managers, and we, oftentimes sitting in front of computers and doing planning and doing preparedness, doing the recovery process. But I want to talk about a little bit more about my experience in 2017. This is the Redwood Valley fire that happened up in the Redwood Valley area of Mendocino County in California. And really, you know, with all the things we were dealing with in that fire, you see all the burned cars that we had to deal with. We had the burned infrastructure, the wetlands, or the areas of watershed that were, you know, impacted, and all the homes that were lost. Over 500 homes were destroyed up there. 9 people just in the Redwood Valley. 9 people of the 24 people who were killed in the Tubbs and Atlas fire died in this area. Redwood Valley is a very small, little rural area. It's accessible through one small winding mountain road, only one way in and one way out. And when people were leaving during this fire, they were literally going through a tunnel of flame as they left. And I want to talk about, in particular, to one family that was involved in this. The vehicle you see in the upper left-hand corner was their vehicle that they were trying to escape their house out of. The mother and the son were in that vehicle. The father and the daughter, I believe, were farther down the road in another vehicle, which was also starting to get burned. I think their tires blew out. This vehicle went off the road. In this vehicle, Kai Logan Shepard, a young man with his mother, panicked, got out of the vehicle and ran basically the wrong way into the fire and perished in the fire. His parents and their sister, Cressa, also tried to escape the fire on foot, and being overcome by the fire, John and Sarah Shepard and Cressa fortunately ran into an ambulance that was in the area trying to also get out of the area, stopped to pick them up and evacuated them. Unfortunately, Cressa died 2 weeks later of her injuries due to that fire. And the reason I'm talking about this really is I want to really have us as emergency managers look at this. This is the Shepard family in happier times. What we do saves lives. It may not be as glamorous as putting the blue stuff on the red stuff or driving police cars, but what we do, the planning and the effort that we take, planning not just for this process, but through the recovery process, it saves lives. And what we learn from these tragedies as we move forward, there's nothing a routine about any of these disasters or any of these fires. Every one of them is different. They look different. They smell different. They are different. But I want to take this photo of the Shepard family and ask you to take it with you. That when you do what you do and do your jobs, know that what you're doing makes a difference. And if we can take the story of the tragedy that befell the Shepard family and move it into our future planning, perhaps we can keep that tragedy from happening to another family. Now we'll turn it over to questions.